Hi, good afternoon. Welcome to this session, your guide to every crypto bill in Congress. My name is Sarah Milby, and I'm Senior Policy Director at Blockchain Association. Before I invite our panelists on stage, I'd like to give a brief introduction to orient you with what is happening on Capitol Hill and give you a little bit of background information to help contextualize our conversation this afternoon. So, first, I think it's important to note that we cannot cover every single crypto bill in Congress. There are over 50 that have been released since this year started. It would take us too many minutes to get through them all. For that reason, we're going to focus on some of the most talked about legislative strategy and some legislative themes for this year. On the slide up here, you can see a short list of bills that we are likely to mention today, and I have included a side note in blue next to the bill name that indicates what target policy area these bills address. Second, it's important to note that in DC right now, there is a divided Congress. This is when Democrats and Republicans each control one, but not both chambers of Congress. It is particularly important because it means that the chances of legislation moving through Congress this year are slim for any bill, let alone a crypto bill. In a divided Congress, we tend to expect that only the largest legislative packages will be negotiated and discussed. An example is the NDAA, which is the National Defense Authorization Act, or the Farm Bill. That being said, small bills, like crypto bills, can be attached to these larger legislative packages and therefore passed into law alongside them. Next, it's important to establish the major congressional committees that are working on crypto issues. These include the House Financial Services Committee and the Senate Banking Committee, which oversee securities and bankings law, and they oversee the SEC. Then there's the House Agriculture Committee and the Senate Agriculture Committee, which both oversee commodities trading and the CFTC. And then finally, there's the Senate Finance Committee, which works on all things tax-related. It could be helpful to keep in mind a few of the topics that these committees have been holding hearings on and are crafting legislation for. Some of these topics include stablecoins and CBDCs, market structure, so think about the regulation of the categorization and trading of securities and commodities. There's custody, national security, so AML CFT programs, know your customer requirements, and tax. And then finally, I'll just give you a very brief overview of what's happening in DC right now. Most importantly, there's a possible government shutdown on the horizon. This shutdown will push votes on other bills, including those on crypto, until later this year. Still, we expect there to be a full House floor vote on two of the crypto bills this year in October or November. Those bills are the Clarity for Payment Stablecoins Act and the Financial and Innovation Technology for the 21st Century Act. And then last but not least, there's Sam Bankman-Fried's court case, which will coincide right when we expect these bills to hit the House floor. The media coverage of this case, in addition to the bills, I think could be a perfect storm for either them passing or falling behind. So it'll be interesting to watch how that plays out, especially after the shutdown. But with that, I will introduce our panelists. We have Joshua Rivera, who is operating partner and general counsel at Blockchain Capital, and Julie Stitzel, vice president of policy for the Digital Currency Group. Please welcome them to the stage. Hi, guys.
Hey.
Hey.
Thank you for joining today. Joshua, I think to start, it would be helpful if you give us a little bit of a history of digital asset legislation. How would you say that it's changed over time, especially since the collapse of FTX?
Yeah, so I guess I will give less of a history and more of a kind of a sense of the feel of it. I think before FTX, we had what I'll call like niche interest in Congress for crypto and kind of crypto legislation. So you had things like the Token Taxonomy Act. You had some other members of Congress interested in pushing certain bills forward, but it wasn't kind of a full-blown, like, we need to grab a hold of this industry. There were some more comprehensive things that Gillibrand and Lummis did that were very good, and a couple other members of Congress and senators. But I think what we saw is a very strong shift in sentiment post-FTX, where all of a sudden everyone has to have a position on the regulation of crypto in Congress. And so the bills that you very helpfully laid out, I think, are they have a lot more teeth to them in terms of the way they could affect the industry. And they try to do more things, I think, with the exception of Gillibrand Lummis bill, which is also very comprehensive. But for example, the Financial Innovation and Technology Act is extremely ambitious and looks to regulate kind of every sector, except for stablecoins, of the crypto industry. And so I think it's very monumental. It's really, we'll talk about this later, but it's a sign of a shift that two of these bills made it out of committee, and it'll be interesting to see how it plays out.
Yeah, Julie, as we look ahead, what would you say some legislative themes you are to emerge for the rest of this year, and what are some bills that you're really excited about?
Yeah, I mean, you touched on them in the beginning, but I think to date in Congress we've seen about 40 digital asset related bills this session, and they've been evenly split between the House and the Senate. And so you have a historic event for the first time ever, we have a comprehensive regulatory framework in the FIT Act passing out of House Financial Services, which was worked on in tandem with the House Agricultural Committee. And then you also have the stablecoin bill, which there was a great panel before, so I won't belabor that. But I think something that we might see rise to the top more in conversations, theme-wise, is potentially national security. And the reason I think that is because, well, while digital assets touches a lot of different facets of policy, national security, I think, demands and requires often a response, and that creates a sense of urgency. So I think we might end up talking more about the relationship between digital assets and national security through the rest of Congress.
What do you think the path forward looks like for the FIT Act and the stablecoin bill?
Yeah, well, if you missed the stablecoin panel before us, their odds were very low at 2%. I'd put the stablecoin bill actually a little bit higher because of the reasons that they actually talked about, which were, Congress has sat with this legislative language for close to 3 years. The administration, in a report that they released a couple years ago, mandated a regulatory framework for stablecoins, and I just think it's an easier sell if it makes it to the Senate. The market structure bill, members of Congress had less time to sit with. I was super heartened by the fact that there was bipartisan vote for both of those bills. But that bill is a beast. It's 200 pages. It covers the gamut. And again, I think it's important to note, though, the historic aspect of it passing out of committee in the first place. And I'm grateful to all of the staffers and the members of Congress who've spent so much time working on this, because it wasn't an easy feat.
Would you guys consider these pieces of legislation to be constructive? And if so, how do you think the industry can help support these legislative efforts?
Well, these two specific bills, definitely constructive. And I think I echo what you say, Julie. Huge thanks and kind of appreciation is merited towards the staffers that worked on these bills, and the posture is the right one. They want to lean in. They want to create something that is workable. As you mentioned, the FIT Act is huge and it tries to do a lot. And so there's going to be a lot of kind of challenges, and I think we'll touch on that in a bit. I would love to, I don't know, maybe I'm jumping ahead, but I'd love to see the stablecoin bill really move through. I think that's low-hanging fruit. And if you had the benefit of watching the better panel, a couple panels before us, then you would have heard some excellent commentators talk about why that is so available, and hopefully Georgia's wrong on her 2%.
I know.
And,
I think it's higher than 2%.
yeah, it's got to be, hopefully.
Julie, how do you think the industry pushes the bills forward? Like, what can we do to be helpful for these things that are so important?
Well, it's been repeated, I think, in previous panels that there's a power of this constituency to reach out to members of Congress. But I think what these bills do for people who are living and breathing it in DC is it gives us a reason to go in and meet with folks, and it's an anchor for education. Prior to this legislation, we were educating on digital assets more broadly, but now we can narrow in on specific use cases and why this is necessary and where there's gray areas with respect to regulation. So, I think activating constituents and recognizing that they have more power probably than we do when we go into an office is important, and then using the bills to anchor our meetings with members.
Yeah, I think if I can touch on that as well, I think one thing that's very difficult is to explain to members of Congress why crypto is different from everything else, right? So the history, the last several thousand years of financial advancement in the world have come on the basis of intermediaries scaling global transactions, right? That's been the paradigm for as long as we remember. And it's great. Intermediaries are super useful. They have allowed us to scale global commerce over that time. But they also have downsides. The biggest issue is that we didn't have an alternative. And now we do. And I think if you think about how that financial infrastructure has advanced over that time, it makes sense that our regulatory frameworks have mapped on to that financial infrastructure centered around intermediaries. And so all of our policymakers have this kind of embedded in their brains, it's almost innate, right, that policy and regulation should kind of act around an intermediary. And what we're building in crypto is very different from that, right? Now we finally have technology that can disintermediate these types of interactions. And when I go to Congress, and I dress better than this.
Yeah, you're San Francisco crypto, I'm DC crypto.
Yeah, this is the San Francisco me. I'm sorry, you guys got the B version of Joshua today. But when I go to Congress, I try to explain that to them, and they're like, yeah, but that just seems incorrect, right? They're generally skeptical of me. I don't think they think I'm a real person, which I get a lot. It's totally fine, right? But they get it kind of from me, or like, oh, you're a VC, you just want to make money. I think what's critical is to have projects go and demonstrate this is how we are creating a different type of financial, or you shouldn't use the word financial, actually, you should use the word value infrastructure, right? We're changing value paradigms in ecosystems that allow people to participate in value exchange without intermediation, and that's really critical. It's easy for them to ignore kind of a few of us, but if people who are building in this industry go and they repeat the ethos of the industry repeatedly, then I hope even our more kind of rooted in their traditional views, members of Congress will kind of start to get the point that these regulatory frameworks have to be different. We have to create new ones.
One of the things I think we saw when the FIT Act and the stablecoin bill went through markup through House Financial Services, Congressman Himes, who's been mentioned, I think, a couple times today, basically said, is the status quo working or is it not? And he does not believe it is. Therefore, there's a need for regulation. And there's so much in that statement, I think, the recognition that digital assets are here to stay, recognizing what people are doing outside of the US, and why it's important for us, which is also brought up in previous panels, to take the lead and set the standard so that we're not reacting to other regs, we're actually leading with our regulation and our regulatory framework.
You guys are talking about a big educational hurdle on the Hill, how we need to show that crypto is different. when we look at new pieces of legislation, there's no such thing as a perfect bill. I think a lot of times we have to take compromises, and especially as we're working for the kind of educational efforts to balance that with the realities of what Congress can put forward. How does that play into each of your calculus about how you push forward different pieces of legislation or choose when to support, oppose, or stay neutral on it?
So that's a very hard question, Sarah. I prefer if you not ask me questions that difficult. I think the efforts, like we've said, it's amazing that we have as many members of Congress and senators interested in creating sensible crypto regulation today. If you had told me that we'd have this many members of Congress kind of trying to do stuff in crypto a year ago, I would have been like, you haven't been paying attention, because I've been doing this for 6 years, and everyone's just like, please leave when I try to talk to them. So I think that that's really important, and as a matter of kind of policy, I want to support those efforts. And so I think the Financial Innovation and Technology Act is an excellent effort, and I support kind of the continuing effort of creating a really helpful bill. It is not a perfect bill. It has many kind of challenges that it still needs to work through. And so my calculus is, how can I continue to engage with these policymakers who have a really hard job of trying to create, greenfield regulatory frameworks for a completely different paradigm for value ecosystems.
And the FIT Act isn't baked either. It's still being negotiated. Right. There's an opportunity to amend it when it goes to rules, if it goes to the Rules Committee. And then if it does go to the House floor, there'll be another opportunity to amend it on the House floor. But I think figuring out your lines prior to being in the heat of the negotiation is important. So best alternative to no agreement, and figuring out where you're going to walk away prior to having everything laid out, or in the heat of the moment.
Yeah, and I think just one more thing. That kind of goes back to why it's so important to demonstrate the need for a different view towards this industry, right? They need to know that what we care about is the ability to create, to build, to allow participation in decentralized and disintermediated networks. And I think for me, that's where, if we are not protecting that with our bills, then it's problematic. Because it's not protecting innovation here in the US, it's also not going to be effective. Like, people are just going to do this somewhere else if our regulatory frameworks don't kind of address the industry the way they should.
So I think your question is about substance, but there's also an aspect of signaling about these bills as well. Yeah. So when you get into the nitty-gritty and you're working through the substance, at a certain point, sequentially, it hits a point where you've been working with members of Congress who are your allies, and eventually this bill's going to move. And you ask a different question then. Am I willing to leave my ally out to dry and not support this bill? So I think there's a political overlay that eventually has to happen as well when you start talking about that.
How important is it to get legislation done given the current regulatory climate, especially with an aggressive SEC and CFTC?
I think you can, depending on what bill you're talking about, but I'll use one example. So we recently saw the release of IRS tax rules that were addressing the broker definition that was included in the infrastructure bill. There is a piece of bipartisan legislation. It was introduced last session, reintroduced this session, the Financial Innovation Act, Keeping Innovation in America Act, sorry, and by Chair McHenry of House Financial Services. In my opinion, that's a better remedy to the broker definition than what's happening with the rulemaking process, because it codifies the definition of broker and it allows for a level of certainty that builders can then work from, as opposed to having a long rulemaking. So I think that bill is something that could pass today.
Yeah, I think broadly, like the point you're making is regulation needs to be sensible, laws need to be sensible, and so I think it is important for something to happen. Just given, like, the SEC is just out there running amok, like they're just doing whatever they want, and I think that is really problematic. And kind of the CFTC enforcement division is starting to be like, that looks fun, I want to do that too. And so that is an extremely damaging regulatory environment for this industry to proliferate in, right? It's just not going to. And so I think we have to do something to counteract that. And even if it's not a perfect bill, we should try to move things forward. Like I was saying earlier, stablecoins should move.
Yeah.
Like that will be super effective for giving some kind of base layer of a regulatory framework that acknowledges the industry, and that's really important. But we have to protect our ability to create decentralized and disintermediated, ecosystems, right? If we're not doing that, then it ends up being worse, right? And the net result, I think, will be the same, where people are like, I don't want to deal with the SEC, so I'm just not going to deal with US persons, which is a really sad outcome. But the fact of the matter is there's a broad enough world out there that they can make that decision.
So Congress tends to wind down its legislative efforts going into an election. Julie, we have an election coming up. So in 2025, how do you think a change in control in the White House and possibly Congress plays into your legislative strategy?
Well, you always want to consider every scenario. So if we have a Republican House, that doesn't necessarily mean that you're going to have a friendly administration, because we saw some, I would put them as anti-crypto activity in the Trump administration. But if you have single rule over the House, the Senate, and the administration, it's a different scenario, right? So that's a long way of saying we consider it. However, I think when you're talking about policy, it's really important that you not consider the short term. You have to consider the long term, particularly for our industry, because we are seeking certainty. And the last thing that we want is a solution that is subjected to the political whims of an outcome of an election. So we need to, and this is why I think all of us in DC are fiercely dedicated to advancing legislation that's nonpartisan. You need Democrats, you need Republicans, and you need to build this healthy roster of individuals that will allow you to sustain those political whims. And so, yes, consider the elections, and I also use it as a line of sight into who could be our allies, who could be our opponents, and who could be recruitable in the incoming Congress. So it's a great way to test, how things are going to look in the next session.
Can it get worse, though? Can it get worse
Yeah.
based on the,
Yeah, it can get worse.
the results?
It can get better and it can get worse.
So sad.
I mean, you've got it divided right now, so.
Yeah.
Joshua, how do you think a change in power in the White House could affect the regulatory state right now?
Yeah, I mean, it's very difficult because I think we don't have a clear picture of who exactly is going to be kind of front running in for the presidency. But I do think part of what we are trying to do in the industry is demonstrate that candidates for public office need to have a sensible position in crypto, because they will suffer if they don't, right? So like, you'll lose votes, you won't be supported financially, versus those who do have sensible positions on policy positions on crypto and are willing to engage with the industry to understand what those should be. The crypto industry is going to rally around them. They're going to support them. And so I think it'll be really interesting to see the run up to November 2024 to see how, crypto policy fits into the platforms of the various candidates.
And you've seen a steady crescendo of candidates talking about this, both Democrats and Republicans, which is heartening. So we'll see. I mean, you have presidential candidates talking about it now, which is not something maybe I would have thought would be happening 4 years ago.
Yeah.
Julie, you were talking about potential opponents. I think we've talked about a lot of what we want to see, but what are some bills or some legislative efforts that could be really detrimental to the industry?
Can see. So that is a bill that, I guess, to paraphrase it, would probably wipe out DeFi. And that goes back to the national security angle that I was talking about earlier. I would hate to repeat the mistake from the infrastructure bill where there's a demand for a response and they miss the step of stakeholder engagement, create a solution that might look great on paper, but then when you practically apply it to the industry, it's either not workable or it decimates an entire industry. I think that's detrimental.
How about you, Joshua?
Yeah, I mean, it's the Cansey Act. It's you hopefully put it at the bottom over here.
Yeah.
I guess we don't have that slide up anymore. Sorry, guys. So there's like one of the ones on the bottom is like a little bit grayed out. Sorry if I'm telling your secrets,
all
Sarah.
good.
But effectively, what it would do is it would hold people responsible for writing code that could be used to move value without conforming to the Bank Secrecy Act regulations, broadly speaking. So writing code or people who control protocols that do that, right, without being registered with FinCEN?
Yeah, I think it's.
And so effectively, you're talking about something, like code is just, it's just like, it's numbers, it's characters, right? So we're talking about holding people responsible who write and publish certain types of things, which sounds really like bad from a First Amendment perspective. So automatically, I feel like we should all be very concerned about the implications of a bill like this. The other thing that I'm concerned about as a venture capitalist, Blockchain Capital is a venture capital company or venture capital firm. We invest in startups, and many of these startups are building decentralized ecosystems. And if you own more than 25 million in value of a decentralized ecosystem that facilitates the transfer of value between people, and it's not registered, then you are liable for those violations.
Yeah.
So that's not super chill. So I think that the orientation around this is really incorrect, right? What they're trying to do is stop North Korea and other bad actors from using systems of value transfer, which I totally get. But there's like a beginning to that, and there's a middle and an end, right? And so like the beginning is like, bad actors actually like, infiltrating different systems. It could happen many different ways. There's the end, like how do they get value out of that system? And what they're doing is they're like targeting the middle of like, oh, like what you guys are doing here in the middle, like we want to clamp down on that. And I think it's going to be ineffective, but it's also going to be like hyper un-American.
Yeah, that's fair. I'm curious if we stay on these opponents for a minute, where do you think their concerns are coming from? Like what's informing them? What do you think their top concerns are?
I mean, that's where it gets tricky, because I would imagine it's briefings that require security clearance. And normally in a non-national security situation, you would understand where they're getting their information. And there's a blind spot there, so you can't even start with where they are because you're not exactly clear where they're starting from. So I would imagine, classified briefings and wherever else they're turning with the agencies within the admin.
I think, yeah, I mean, from a national security perspective, it is very difficult to stop bad actors. And again, like going back, I'm going to just keep harping on this. This is kind of like the most important thing, right? We have an entire global financial ecosystem built on intermediation, right? That is the basis of it. And so for as long as we have known, the way that we have chosen to combat bad acting in that ecosystem is by clamping down on those intermediaries. Like, give me all the information that you have on everyone who transacts on your platform that you intermediate, right? And there is a very open question as to how effective that is, right? Basically, it's just like, giving just, terabytes of information to, centralized regulators to help them, see the world more clearly. But I think there's a very real question that we should be asking. Is a different paradigm that is disintermediated, does it require the same types of enforcement? And I think it doesn't, but we have to work through what it actually looks like.
And just our last question, I know we're close to time. So what's one bill you think is most likely to move in the 118th Congress?
Most likely, well, this isn't a bill, but I am keeping my fingers crossed for a spot Bitcoin ETF approval.
Oh, that's nice.
Yeah.
I think it'll happen. We'll see. I don't know. I think it. I mean, I'm hopeful for the stablecoin bill. Just we should all agree on that. It shouldn't be that difficult.
I think there is agreement. Right now, it's just a jurisdictional fight, and that's between the Fed and the states. They can get past that.
Yeah, let's do it.
Sails through.
Stablecoins.
Well, time will tell.
Yeah.
Thank you guys so much
Thank
for
you.
the panel.
Thank you.
Thanks.